Hello, hello. I'm Pau, and in this video, I'm bringing you a very, very interesting case that happened in the United States in 2009. It's a very shocking case. When I was researching it, it really surprised me, but I hope you like it. Annie Lee was born on July 3rd, 1985, in San Jose, California. She grew up with a large and very close-knit family. They describe her as a kind person who cared about others and always helped those in need. She was very friendly, positive, and they said she had a bright and energetic personality. She was always smiling and making others laugh. She was also very smart, the most studious in her class, and had perfect grades, so after high school she was offered a $160,000 scholarship to study at the University of Rochester in New York, where she studied biology. While in college, she met a guy named Jonathan Widowski, whom she fell in love with shortly after. He was studying physics and mathematics. Annie said he was her soulmate, her best friend, and after graduating from college, Jonathan proposed to Annie, who happily accepted. After getting engaged, they started with all the wedding preparations. They decided to plan the wedding for a year, and Annie was very excited about all the details, her dress, the flowers, and they were also looking for the perfect venue for the event. They soon chose the date for their wedding, September 13th, 2009. Unfortunately, a tragedy occurred before the most anticipated day of her life. Annie was very excited about the wedding, but at the same time she was very stressed because she didn't have much help with the preparations. Her fiancé was studying for a PhD at Columbia University, while Annie was accepted to Yale, where she studied pharmacology. Annie was very involved in school. She was doing research that would help patients with various diseases like cancer and diabetes. She also wrote for the school newspaper. She wrote an article about crime and safety on campus, where she spoke with the chief of police and wrote safety tips to stay safe. Annie wrote this without knowing that her own life was the one at risk. It was September 8th, 2009. The wedding was just a few days away, and Annie still had many things to do. She was trying to balance her private life, the wedding preparations, and school. That day, Annie left her apartment early in the morning. She was on her way to her office in the medical area of the Yale campus. She was there until 10 a.m. After that, she entered another campus building where the laboratory where she was doing her research was located. Surveillance cameras see her entering the building shortly after 10 a.m. And that was the last time she was seen alive. Hours passed, it was already getting dark, and one of Annie's roommates began to worry a lot because it was late and she still hadn't returned home. She tried calling her cell phone several times, but Annie never answered. Her roommate was very worried because Annie used to be a very responsible and punctual person. She always arrived home at the same time, and if she was going to be late, she would call to let her know. Besides, she always answered calls, and on this occasion, she wasn't doing it. In addition, at that time many crimes against women were being reported on campus, so she was even more worried. Since there was no sign of Annie, her friend decided that the best thing was to call the police. At first, the police thought it was a case of a runaway bride. The police thought that maybe Annie didn't want to get married anymore, maybe she had regrets, or maybe she was very stressed by all the wedding preparations, so maybe she decided to run away. Her friend told the police that Annie wouldn't do that and asked them to go look in her office, where authorities found her cell phone, wallet, and bank cards. It didn't make sense that she would have run away without necessary things like money, clothes, or supplies. In addition, her friends and family said that Annie was very happy and excited about the wedding. It was something she longed for. She wanted it very much and never had doubts about wanting to get married. So it made no sense at all that she would have run away to avoid the wedding. Officers obtained the surveillance camera footage where they discovered the last recording of Annie entering the building where the lab is located at 10:09 a.m. Thanks to the electronic record, they knew that she entered the laboratory at 10:11 a.m. After that, they didn't discover any more clues about Annie. Although something very suspicious did happen. 3 hours after Annie entered the lab, someone set off the fire alarm, so the entire building had to evacuate. But among that crowd, Annie was not found, and neither was a fire found. The police thought that either it was a joke in very bad taste, especially for university and graduate students, or they thought that maybe the person who set off the alarm was responsible for her disappearance, looking for a distraction. Authorities began the investigation and search process. They printed posters with Annie's information, hoping someone had seen her or could provide information about her. However, days passed without knowing absolutely anything about Annie. Until the fourth day, September 13th, the day Annie was supposed to get married, officers found evidence. They found a green blouse with several bloodstains. This blouse was identical to the one Annie is seen wearing the day she disappeared. They discovered this blouse in the ceiling ducts located outside the lab where Annie worked. Investigating the area further, other objects were also found. For example, there were rubber gloves covered in blood, a sock, and lab work boots, which had a tag or the name Ray C or Ray C as initials. In the lab, there were also small bloodstains that someone had tried to clean, but again, no sign of Annie. Officers believe someone had taken Annie's life inside the lab, and the person responsible had been quick to dispose of the body. They began looking for clues, but officers thought that at this point, Annie was likely already dead, so they were looking for traces or parts of her body. They did this in various local dumpsters and in nearby cities. They were searching for Annie on and off the Yale campus. One of the officers was inside the building where the lab was located, in the basement area, when he suddenly noticed a very strong and unpleasant odor. Upon reporting it, authorities brought in police dogs immediately, which were specifically trained to find cadavers. And at 5 p.m., the same time Annie was supposed to be walking down the aisle at her wedding, her body was found. Sadly, they discovered Annie's body inside a wall. It was positioned upside down. Now that they had found Annie's body, the investigation changed course. It was no longer a missing person case. Now it was a homicide. And they wondered who could be capable of committing this horrible act and why. The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was asphyxiation. Afterward, the person responsible for her death broke several of her bones to make her fit between the walls, as it was a very, very small space. And there were also signs that she had been assaulted before her life was taken. When the news became public, the entire community was sad and concerned. University students were very afraid and in shock over what happened. But those most affected, obviously, were Annie's family and friends. They couldn't believe how someone could have been capable of hurting her this way, and also how her life had been taken during one of its most beautiful stages. She was about to get married. She was studying at the university of her dreams, working to help patients with terminal illnesses. She was fulfilling her dreams and had so much more to live for. What happened to her is a tragedy. Annie had 2 memorial services, one in California, attended only by her family, and another in New York, which was televised and attended by over 600 people, where her relatives said their goodbyes. Meanwhile, officers continued the investigation on campus. And after a couple of days, the police made the first arrest. It was a 24-year-old man named Raymond Clark who worked in the lab with Annie. He was arrested 4 days after her body was discovered, and he was hiding in a motel. According to people who knew him, Raymond, or Ray, was a quiet, shy, friendly, and popular man. He played baseball and volunteered at homeless shelters. They said he was a genuine and nice person. When he was arrested for his alleged involvement in the case, everyone was shocked. They said they'd never noticed anything strange about him, that he seemed like a very happy person who always smiled at others. They also mentioned that they had never seen him angry. He started working at the Yale lab in 2004 and had never had any problems there, not with the equipment, his colleagues, or superiors. However, detectives said they began to suspect him early in the investigation because surveillance showed him cleaning the lab, even after it had already been cleaned by the janitorial staff. They discovered this early on when they started reviewing the surveillance cameras. But what made them even more suspicious was when they found Annie's blouse covered in blood. Remember that work boots were also found, which were labeled as Ray C or Ray C. Well, that's his name, Raymond Clark. Detectives asked him if he saw Annie that day. He replied that he saw her leaving the lab around 12:45 p.m. on September 8th, the day she disappeared, but that he didn't interact with her. They didn't even say hello. While they were questioning him, detectives noticed Raymond had scratches on his face, shoulders, and arms, but he said his cats did it. Officers asked him for a DNA sample, and when they got the results, they confirmed that his DNA was on Annie's body and her clothes. To enter the lab, you need an access card, and that day, according to the electronic log, the only people who entered were Raymond and Annie. It was also discovered that Raymond was the one who accidentally tripped the fire alarm switch. When authorities investigated inside Raymond's apartment, they found several red stains in his kitchen that appeared to be blood, plus there were also samples of Annie's DNA. So, the officers already had the body and the culprit. But what was his motive? This remains a mystery to this day, as Raymond never wanted to confess, but there are different theories. The first is that he and Annie were in a romantic relationship. The theory says that on the day of the events, Annie went to the lab to break up with him because her wedding day was approaching, but Raymond got so angry that he committed the crime. Although everyone said Raymond was a nice and good person, remember that people described him as someone very good, gentle, and that they had never seen him angry. Well, his ex-girlfriend gave her testimony and said they had a good relationship. His ex-girlfriend from high school, They had a good relationship, but when she wanted to break up with him, he got very angry and she even had to call the police because he had become very violent. But Annie's friends say this theory is completely false and that she would never cheat on her fiancé. The second theory is that Raymond was obsessed with Annie, but since she constantly rejected him and her wedding day was approaching, he thought he would lose her forever, so he decided to take her life. It was one of those situations where if I can't have you, no one else can. I think text messages were found between Raymond and Annie, where he often wrote to her, "How are you? See you today at the lab, smiley face," that kind of thing. And Annie would respond very curtly, as it was clear she had no interest in starting a relationship with him, not even a friendship. The next theory is that Raymond was obsessed with control and cleanliness and hated that Annie was disorganized when leaving the lab and left some things out of place. This to me is the least credible theory, because it's not really known if he has OCD or not. And no one mentioned that Annie was a disorganized person either. I feel like she doesn't give that impression. Obviously, I don't know her, but I feel like if she really were a disorganized person, they would have mentioned it when describing her. But she seemed to be a very orderly woman in every sense. Perfect grades, very studious, she was planning her wedding at the same time as conducting research. I don't know, I feel like those are things only a very organized person could do. Although it doesn't mean that a very organized person can't be a bit disorganized with their environment. For example, I'm disorganized with my environment, but very organized in other aspects. But I'm getting off topic. Anyway, for me this is the least credible theory. And the last theory is that he was jealous of Annie. Annie was a very intelligent and successful person. She had been at Yale for a short time and was already an outstanding student. Maybe he felt intimidated by that. Maybe he thought, how is it possible that I've been working here for 5 years and I have the same position as her who just arrived? It's just a theory, but as I mentioned, the motive remains a mystery. During the trial, Raymond pleaded not guilty despite all the evidence against him, but after being offered a deal, he pleaded guilty. The deal consisted of reducing the sentence. It went from 60 years to 44 years in prison for the homicide, so he'll be in prison until he's 68 years old. And that's all the information about the case. As I mentioned, it's a very sad, unfortunate case, but at the same time super shocking, especially because the motive is unknown. It's not known why he did that. Of course, there's no valid reason to harm someone else, but I find it surprising how your coworker, your lab partner, would be capable of doing that to you for no apparent reason. I'm glad Annie got justice, and I hope Raymond really learns his lesson in prison, because what he did was super, super wrong.